Good morning, everyone. My name is Megan Barrett, and I am the director at the Iowa Quilt Museum. The Iowa Quilt Museum is located in Winterset, Iowa, which is just southwest of Des Moines. And if you're not familiar with us, we'd love to have you bop over to our website and learn a little bit more about us. Our website is iowaquiltmuseum.org. And today we're here to talk about this wonderful quilt that's over my right shoulder. I'm going to talk about that just a little bit more in a minute or two here. But I'm actually upstairs in the Quilt Museum. We have just recently renovated this upstairs space. Downstairs is our gallery, and right now our exhibit is titled A Quilted Garden, and they are all quilts from the New England Quilt Museum in Lowell, Massachusetts. We actually change our exhibit 4 times a year, and we are not a collecting museum. Everything we display is on loan to us for the duration of that particular exhibit. We borrow from other museums, private collectors. If they're contemporary quilts, we borrow from artists themselves. And so we would love to have you come visit us here in Winterset, Iowa. We're also the home of the John Wayne Birthplace Museum. John Wayne was born right here in Winterset, and there's a museum dedicated to his childhood home and some artifacts from his movies as well. And we are the Bridges of Madison County, if you're familiar with that book or the movie or the musical. That takes place here in Madison County, Iowa. So that's just a little bit about us and me. But now back to this quilt that we're going to talk about, this beautiful Bullseye quilt that belonged to the Neifert family. And so I'm just going to introduce the other guests who are on with me this morning. First, we have Carl Neifert, who is a Winterset resident, and Barb Garrett, who is joining us from Pennsylvania. Good morning, Carl and Barb, or good afternoon to Barb. It's already 1 o'clock.
Hello.
So let's start with just some introductions. Carl, would you mind just introducing yourself for a moment and telling us about just a couple things about yourself?
Uh, Carl Neifert. I'm a retired extension worker from Iowa State University, and I guess that's my history. I worked for Iowa State for about 38 years. So,
And have you always lived in Winterset, Carl?
I was born in Marion County in Knoxville area. Lived in Iowa all my life. Worked in 3 or 4 different county offices, and then a livestock specialist the last 15 years of employment.
Excellent. And this quilt has come from your family, which we will talk more about in a little bit. So let's give a moment to Barb to introduce herself because she is our resident expert today.
Thank you, Megan. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I love talking about Pennsylvania quilts. I consider myself a quilt historian. I didn't grow up with quilts. I actually saw my first quilt in 1968 and decided I wanted to start making them. There were very few instructions available, so I started going to antique shops and flea markets and looking at Pennsylvania quilts. And that's where my love grew. I saw mostly Pennsylvania German quilts, lots of Pennsylvania Dutch quilts. I design and make my quilts using 1/4-inch graph paper. I'm a retired math teacher, and 1/4-inch graph paper is my friend. I make and design historic reproduction doll quilts. I've done about 300 or so of those, and I tell the history of quilting through those. In the late 1980s, I had the very good fortune to become involved with quilt documentation projects in Pennsylvania. Many states have documentation projects. Pennsylvania does county projects. We are blessed with an overabundance of quilts, and so each county does their own, except for a couple of the lesser populated counties they band together. This has been going on since the late 1980s, and it's still happening. Currently, the Lebanon County documentation is on hiatus due to COVID, but I am thrilled to be able to be involved with them. I also work with museums and historical societies, updating their records and cataloging their exhibits. My special areas of interest are Pennsylvania Dutch, Pennsylvania German quilts. They mean the same thing. German is Deutsch and it anglicizes to Dutch. It has nothing to do with Holland, and Fietsack quilts. And I am continually looking and learning and getting excited about new finds like the picture you posted on your Facebook page of this wonderful quilt. Thank you for inviting me to share.
Well, we're so happy to have you join us this morning. And so that's kind of a great segue, that talking about that Facebook page. So let me just give you a little bit of background about how this quilt or how this particular program came to be. So Carl reached out to me in December and said, I have these 2 family quilts. Could I bring them in to have you look at them and tell me, anything that you can tell me about them? Which is not an unusual request. We get that request fairly frequently here at the museum. And although I am not a quilt historian myself, I have no formal training in quilts. We do have knowledgeable people on our board of directors. And so I said, sure, bring them on in. We'll take a look at them. We'll tell you what we can tell you. And as we were looking at this quilt right here, I snapped a photo and put it on Facebook. And the 3 of us who looked at it we marveled at it because we had never seen a design like this. And as I said, I'm not a quilt historian, but in the 5 years I've worked here, I've encountered a lot of quilts. And to have never seen a pattern like this, I was just kind of amazed at that. So this photo we posted on Facebook just really kind of started to create a lot of buzz and comments and likes and shares, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the persons who commented was Barbara Garrett. And then she emailed me and said, I recognize this pattern. I've seen it before, and I think that it's a regional Pennsylvania pattern. I wonder if the family has any Pennsylvania connections. And we reached out to Carl and his daughter, actually, who is kind of she and her husband are the family historians. And I asked if they had had any connections to Pennsylvania, and lo and behold, they do. And so on Tuesday, we spoke to Carl and no, I'm sorry, this is Tuesday. On Saturday, we spoke to Carl and his daughter, Sarah, and her wife, Forrest, about the Neifert family migration and this quilts migration from Pennsylvania to Iowa. And I'm going to share a video of that in a few minutes. But first, we want to show you a few more photos just to give you a little bit more context for what we're talking about. So, Barb, can you see that photo?
Yes.
Good. I must have done it correctly then. This is the full shot of the quilt that you can see over my shoulder. And we're just going to go, I'm going to go through, I've got a few close-ups for you to see, since you probably can't see it terribly well in my video.
Make note of the border treatment, the diamonds, because we're going to compare that border treatment later on to some other pictures. So just make note of the diamonds and make note of that little flower.
And this, do we call this a little sunburst? Is that what we refer
A
to?
sunburst or a star.
We wanted to do some fabric comparison. So I've got some real close-ups of some.
And that, oh, can you go back to that one? Yeah, that's one of the rings, and this is the color combination that we see, the red and green and yellow or cheddar. There's a variety of those 2 as the lights. Notice the triple rod quilting in the white. They're heavily, heavily quilted.
Mm-hmm. Triple rod quilting. I did not know that term. Good.
Yeah, that's the 3 pieces, the 3 rows, 3 lines and then a space, 3 lines and then a space.
So when Barb pointed this out to me, she classified it as a Berks County quilt, regional quilt. So do you want to, I'm pointing out Berks County now on the map.
Okay, Berks County is the the blue shaped county furthest over to the right. And all of the quilts that have been discovered and are documentable in this design all come from one tiny little area in Berks County that we'll talk about. The little tiny area is sort of up where the R is. It's a little town. In a bit, we will also, oh, okay.
Let me go back.
Yeah. In a bit, we will also be talking about a couple of quilts from Lancaster County, which is just below Berks, and a couple of quilts from Montgomery County, which is in the orange to the side of Berks. This is all considered southeastern Pennsylvania, which is a hotbed of Pennsylvania German immigration, settlement, and descendants. And to give you an idea of how lucky I am, if you see where Lancaster County, Berks County, and Chester County all come together in a point, that's where I live. And so I've had the very good fortune to be able to look at lots and lots of quilts over the last 45, 50 years.
Sure. So you're right in a hotbed of.
I really am. I couldn't be placed better.
So it's interesting to think about that. Are you placed in the right place, or do you have such an interest in quilting because of where you're placed?
I think my interest was enabled and allowed to grow because of where I am.
Yeah.
I grew up sewing. My mother did not quilt. I'm of the chenille bedspread generation of the 1950s. We didn't have quilts at home. We had chenille bedspreads. But I just fell in love with them once I saw them.
So this map shows specifically Albany Township. Am I correct in that, Barb?
Yes.
So Albany Township is a portion of Berks County, and you can see it's right here next to Interstate 78.
And Interstate 80 is up in the white part of your screen.
Okay.
Albany Township is between 78 and 80, the same Interstate 80 that you're very close to.
Yep, runs all the way across the country and is just 15 minutes north of Winterset, in fact.
Which helps explain a lot of the migration pattern.
Yeah.
But if you look at this map, on the yellow line, which is Interstate 78, there's a town called Lenhartsville. That is where these quilts have been described as being from in the literature over the last 40, 45 years that we've known about them. Lenhartsville is what we call a crossroads town. There's two roads going through it and maybe a half dozen houses. So what really happens is that the quilts were made on farms surrounding Lenhartsville. But it's easier to locate a town than a farm. And you can see how close Albany Township is to Lenhartsville. This is the area. In a couple of minutes, we're going to be seeing an almost identical quilt that is owned by the Berks Historical Society. And it was made by a woman who lived outside of Edinburgh, which is just to the left of Lenhartsville. So this is the region that we're talking about. And to help locate it for people, a little further west is Hamburg, to the south is Reading, and to the east is Allentown, Schuylkill County. So.
Great. So here is a photo of a quilt from a museum catalog. And at first glance, you think you're looking at the same quilt that's behind me. Now take a closer glance. And it's not. And this is where Barb asked you to take a look at the border treatment. So you'll see that the Neifert family quilt, you remember, is a square or kind of a square in a square type border treatment or diamonds. and this one is hexagons. But beyond that, and I'll just kind of scoot over so you can see the two at the same time. Beyond that, these two quilts are remarkably similar.
They have the same circular patterns. They have the same lily tulip kind of flower in the bottom. When I had the good fortune of being able to visit the Berks Historical Society last week to study this quilt and compare it to the one at the Iowa Museum. And the bottom tulips, bottom lilies are identical. The little petally flowers are identical, and the stars are the same. The tulips on the side, on the Berks County one, they go up, and on the Iowa one, they go down. But they're the same shape, the same size, and the same design.
And they're
this,
both, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, this quilt appears to be made in the same area. This is the one that was made in Edinburgh. And the Historical Society does know the name of the woman who made it. And we'll talk about her after a bit, but they do know the name of the woman who made it. Okay.
And this is the photo that Barb took when she was actually with the quilt last week. So that gives you just a little bit better look at the fabrics. I think I've got some close-ups. Here's our lily here and our.
Okay, there's the lily. The reds are solid. The greens are solid in both quilts. The pink is what we call a soft pink, putting it in a time frame of 1840 to 1860. It is a double pink, but it's not the really bright double pink that we had after the Civil War when the aniline dyes came in. So since most all of the quilts are anonymous, they're maker unknown because they were purchased by dealers in the 1970s and 80s, and they were going for visual. They didn't care who made it. They just cared that it was pretty and they could sell it to somebody. Up until now, we have dated these quilts 1850 to 70. Or 1845 to 70, or circa 1860. And we have some exciting news afterwards. But the yellow is a little print. The little doodly, as I call them, that's in the yellow is a brown. It's not a black, which also puts it in that same time period. You can almost see little shadows depending on your magnification. And this is the center. You can see the beautiful workmanship. You can see the beautiful quilting. We call the color cheddar in Pennsylvania. I was told by a friend who lives in Vermont, that's not cheddar. Cheddar is yellow. But in Pennsylvania, this is cheddar on our quilts. That's not a necessary time period name. It's what we call it so that when we talk to each other, we're all speaking the same language. The pink is the print, and you can see it's just a very light, soft pink, not the garish bright pink.
Here's a great close-up of the double pink.
Yeah.
I think I've sometimes heard the orange referred to as chrome orange.
Yes.
As well.
Yeah, is also referred to as that. A tremendous amount of geometry, piecing involved with it. And I do have to say the border is octagons, not hexagons. It's the math teacher in me. Otherwise, one of my friends who's listening to this will correct me later on. But it's just fascinating to me how similar they are. When I visited the Berks Historical Society, the genealogist there is very excited that there is another quilt so similar that has a name attached to it. We know that this quilt was made by Sarah Hines, who lived in Edinburgh. And that genealogist can't wait until he gets all the information that Carl and Sarah have provided about their family, because he's going to be looking for comparisons, family, cousins, neighbors, whatever. And that's not my area of expertise, so I'll let him do that. And then and then the two museums will be sharing information.
Absolutely. So I think this is a good time for me to go ahead and share the video that we took on Saturday, because you'll hear us refer to Berks County and you'll hear us refer to Albany Township. You'll hear us refer to the quilts, plural, and that's us talking about the Neifert family quilt and the one that's at the Berks Historical Society. And so I'm going to go ahead and do a screen share of that video. It's about 9 minutes long. And again, we'll be hearing from Carl and his daughter, Sarah Parks, and her husband, Forrest. And this is talking specifically about the Neifert family's kind of migration from Pennsylvania to Iowa. So we are here with Sarah Parks, who is a member of the Neifert family. And Sarah is going to give us a little bit of insight into the history of this quilt and how it came through the Neifert family from Pennsylvania, eventually to Iowa, and how it ended up here at the Iowa Quilt Museum. So thanks for joining us today, Sarah. Sarah, do you live in Iowa?
I don't. I live in Texas now.
Okay.
We've been stationed here. Well, we've been here for 13 years, not stationed anywhere. We just planted, rooted up. Here we are. But I'm an Iowa girl, born and raised, and spent my first 20 years there.
Very good. And as we understand it, you were kind of the family genealogist or historian, and so that's why we're talking to you today, or your husband Forrest is.
That's him.
That's him. Good.
Yes.
Good.
I recruited well.
Yes, for sure. Well, thanks both of you for being here today to talk to us about this quilt that we're so excited about. So let's start with how this quilt came, or how the Neifert family kind of thought to reach out to the Iowa Quilt Museum about this quilt.
Well, my grandmother, Helen Neifert, and had this quilt for years and years and years and years. I'm pretty sure it was probably given to Grandpa Neifert and passed on through his family for several years, and nobody ever really brought it out, or obviously didn't use it. It wasn't there. I don't think it was ever put on a bed that I've ever remembered seeing. I don't think my dad ever remembers seeing it either. I think he talked about he's never seen it displayed on a bed, used. Brought out to show every once in a while, hey, look at this quilt. This is your family's quilt. And it had a little piece of paper on it with it handwritten. This is Lydia Bates Neifert's quilt. And but it had been kept in cedar chests for years and years. And my grandma and grandpa had moved into a assisted living place and had to downsize a lot. And so Dad had them, and we pulled them out and looked at them. He says, what should we do with them? And Winterset has a beautiful little quilt museum. And I said, Dad, I don't know what their value is. And so he said, let's take them.
Well, I'd asked Megan and her staff to take a look at those and evaluate them in terms of if there was any significant historical value or something like that. And then the more we talked and the more she gave me feedback, I thought this is an opportunity to have some continuing education on something that belonged to our family. And I thought that was a logical place to send them, and my daughter agreed. And so that's where we are today.
Sarah and Forrest, can you tell us a little bit about your family's not lineage down to the every single person, but kind of the general migration of the Neifert family from Pennsylvania to Iowa?
Okay, so the Neifert family it was spelled Neufert at one point, Neifert, which is like new horse. They came in and settled into Pennsylvania.
Yeah,
And
so the Neiferts arrived on Hans Jacob Neifert arrived on the ship Nancy in Pennsylvania. I think it was Philadelphia in 1752. And for several generations, the Neiferts stayed in Berks County, Pennsylvania. So if we go from Hans Jacob Neifert, then his son Johann Neifert, and then his grandson Jacob Neifert. And Jacob Neifert was the husband of Lydia Bates Neifert, who was the originator of the quilt. Their son was born on the farm in Pennsylvania, and then they moved to Attica. Well, he died in Attica, Iowa, Marion County, Iowa. And so Lydia Bates and her descendants moved from Pennsylvania, and then we go from David Bates Neifert to Jonathan Bates Neifert to Noel J. Neifert to Dale Vernon Neifert to Carl, and then to Sarah. And for the most part, well, they never left Iowa. Some of the siblings and whatever left, but I guess the main line stayed put and kind of bounced around Iowa a little bit, and the quilt kind of followed. I want to say it was the first son kind of thing.
Yes.
And ended up in Carl, well, in Helen's Dale's possession, and then went to Carl when they had to downsize.
So, Carl, if I'm counting correctly, you are the 5th generation of the owner of this quilt, from Lydia to Jonathan to Noel to Dale and now to Carl. Is that correct?
That sounds right.
All right. And at some point, it was the quilt maker herself who lived in Pennsylvania early in her life and then actually moved to Iowa. Mm-hmm.
Born in Berks County, Pennsylvania. And I've done some research into her family. We think her mother was a Bates and her father was a Bates, but they weren't necessarily, they obviously weren't brother and sister, but they were probably more likely first cousins or second cousins. And because the families stayed, like you were saying, the maker of the other quilt in Pennsylvania very well could have been a neighbor. And we've seen that throughout the when the Neiferts moved, the people they lived next to tend to move with them. And in a perfect case is the Neiferts and the Gaumonts were neighbors as they moved. They were neighbors in Pennsylvania, but they never married until Sarah's grandparents. They moved around. So she married in 1828 when she was 19, 20 years old. They had 10 children. She died in Marysville, Iowa, and that's where she's buried. So that's kind of where they started, where they ended up. There was nothing in between on census records or anything like that. I haven't found any record that said they stopped. There was a big migration of the Dutch from Pennsylvania to Iowa, and especially where the Neiferts settled. There's still a big
there's still a big
what's the
German, that's an Amish.
the thing, the parade,
The pellet
Pelletula time.
Yeah.
And so I mean there was a connection from one place to the next, and it just kind of continued on.
Very strong Dutch and German ancestry in that area still.
Yeah, so she was married in Pennsylvania, and I was looking almost the entire family, and I would, if I wanted to see if there was a link between the Neiferts and the Hines, I would look at the Bethlehem Lutheran Church records,
Mhm.
because everything about the family a lot of it has come from those church records, and they go back to 1768.
Wow.
And so births, marriages, it's in there, and it's interesting. It's all in German, so.
Good luck.
60. So Barb, let me pass things back over to you.
The first published picture mention of this bullseye style quilt that I am aware of is in the Orlanski book from 1974. Back in the 1970s, as I said, dealers were not interested in historical documentation, so we were left with dating quilts by educated guess, basically, looking at the fabrics, looking at the style of patterns. Very few quilts had names on. There are about a dozen known examples of these bullseye quilts in private and public collections. And up until now, only two have had names associated with them. But none of them have migrated out of the area until this one came to light back in December. So based on the fabrics, which are the pre-Civil War 1840 to 1860 fabrics, the date given to these quilts is circa 1860, which means 10 years before, 10 years after, but that's the basic time period. And that's all we were able to narrow it down to. The one that the Historical Society in Berks County owns, that woman stayed in Berks County. So we don't have any benchmarks of, did she make it in her early life, her middle life, late in life? We can't tell. But because we have such a wonderful genealogy, thanks to Forrest, we know that Lydia's husband was on the rolls of the Jerusalem Evangelical Lutheran Church in April of 1856. So they were still in Berks County in 1856. And he also found on the census records in Iowa that he and his family appear in the 1860 Iowa census. So we know that Lydia moved sometime between 1856 and 1860, which means the quilt made in Berks County was made prior to 1856. And this is the first concrete documented date that we have to narrow down the time period. And that's the exciting news.
It is. And so I'm going to interject for just a second here because Carl said something on Saturday when we were on, and I did not put it in the video, but I want to prompt him to say it again. And that is, Carl, tell us a little bit about how you knew who made this quilt. When you brought it to me, tell me about the record that you brought to me.
Yeah, the record and documentation was written down by my mother, and she had handwritten the information after conferring with my dad and etc. The lineage that she recalled, and that's why we were able to document that in her handwriting. So that was a major foresight or luck on her part to do that, and then Sarah and Forrest were able to use that and document that information as being indeed correct. So, and I guess that makes sense.
Absolutely. And it's important, you know, both things that you said. It's important that your mother took the time to write that down in family history. It's also important that Forrest and Sarah have been able to corroborate or substantiate that with historical evidence. Because as quilt historians know, oftentimes a passed down family history, especially if it's an oral history can be incorrect. People remember things or hear things, or they're just not quite right. But the fact that this is substantiated with some very reliable records is just really wonderful. And so this is my opportunity to pull out my soapbox and say, label your quilts, people. Label the quilts you're making, label the quilts that you have in your possession that are from your family. And we think it's best if you write that on a muslin label and sew it to the back, because that always goes with the quilt. We're very fortunate that that piece of paper from your mother, Carl, never got lost, and we do have it preserved now with the quilt, but that can be lost apart from a quilt. So do that. Don't kid yourself and don't delude yourself into thinking that somebody won't want to know that you made this quilt someday. All right, so Barb, shall we start looking at some of the other photos of the other type of quilts? Yeah.
Okay. When I saw the posting, you can put a quilt up. When I saw the posting of the quilt that came in to the Iowa Museum, Carl's quilt, I was just thrilled because, as I said, this is a rare, localized pattern found to have only been made in the Lenhartsville area of Berks County. And I'm not sure of the exact number that have been found, and I may be unaware of one or two in private collections if I don't know the collector. There's only about a dozen known. And as I said, they're primarily maker unknown. And here suddenly, out in the middle of Iowa, another one appeared that hasn't been published. So these are oh, that's the Berks one. As you can see, some of them do have different styles of tulips, slightly different borders. Some of them have diamonds and some have triangles in the bullseye portion. Individual designs, but all basically the same. There's the little tiny petaled flower again. The same side tulips, only a few more side tulips in this one. Okay. This one is in a private collection, but if you look at it, you can see that it's very similar to the previous one. This maker used more of a yellow instead of a cheddar color. So they were making the same quilt, but to their own tastes. If you are looking at a big enough picture, you can see that the outside border is that same diamond as in Carl's quilt. Okay.
This is the one from the Orlanski Collection that you mentioned when we first started.
This is the earliest that I know of a picture being published of it, and that was in 1974. Those not familiar with what happened with quilts in the 1970s, lots of dealers were buying Pennsylvania quilts and selling them out of the state of Pennsylvania to people in New York, California, all over the place. And this was published, and that was sort of the first time a date was given to it. It was a broad date, 1850 to 75, which sort of narrows down to circa 1890. And we have now narrowed it further thanks to Carl and Sarah's quilt. Okay. This quilt is the Bullseye quilt that was published.
This one's in the Mint Museum.
The Mint Museum. Thank you. Again, very similar to the previous one, but owned by the Mint Museum. Okay.
The starbursts are quite a bit different in this one, but they're wonderful. I love the starbursts in this one.
Mm-hmm.
This one's the Pook.
This was sold at auction in 2012. It was It was a private collection that Pook Auction House in my area sold. So it had been owned by a local Berks County collector, and he sold it. You can see that the tulips are shaped a little bit differently, but we've still got the same basic pattern. We've still got the same basic outer border with the diamond shapes.
This one has some amazing quilting in it.
Yeah.
Wowza.
And the stars on the outside are more mariner compass type stars rather than stars. But that's all individual. Okay, this was in Rod Kirchhoff's book from 1993. He lists it as a rising sun or bullseye circa 1860 to 1880 in Indiana. If you know where Interstate 80 goes, it goes from Pennsylvania into Ohio, into Indiana, Illinois, and on to Iowa. So this quilt, even though he found it in Indiana, I do believe it is from the same Pennsylvania, Lenhartsville area. But quilt history is ever evolving, ever changing, and ever growing. And in 1993, the general feeling was if a quilt was found in an area, it was made in the area perhaps, which is why he listed it as an Indiana quilt, but it's a Pennsylvania quilt that moved to Indiana, in my opinion. Same little tulip, same little flowers. This quilt shows that the Pennsylvania Germans, once they latch onto a design that they like, they don't always let it go immediately. This quilt was made a little bit east of the Albany Township area in 1920. And they do have information about this, but you can see that it's kind of the next generation's version of what great grandma made. So that's why I threw that in. Okay, talking about our little,
I think I'll pause for just a couple minutes, Barb, because we do have some questions that have come into the
oh,
chat.
sure.
Yeah. So mathematician and quilter that you are, how did the circles come to be so symmetrical?
Part of education back in the 1800s was learning how to use a compass. And 360 degrees can be divided, and they knew how to do it. It's the same kind of thinking as the early mariner's compass quilt blocks. So they used their compasses.
Now, in regards to the fabrics, are these fabrics that were only available in that particular area in Pennsylvania? Or, as Marlene is asking, could it have been possible that she saved the fabric and brought the pattern with her, or that she brought the pattern with her rather, and made it with fabrics that she purchased in Iowa?
Okay. I think we have to look a little bit, and this is my interpretation, at the state of settlement in 1850-60. In Pennsylvania, southeastern Pennsylvania in 1856, the people had been there over 100 years. They were middle-class farmers, and the fabrics were available in the stores. I personally don't believe that a person filling a covered Conestoga wagon to go to Iowa would take the raw materials. I think she would take the finished quilt that she and her friends, sisters, cousins, mother, all worked on that pattern, and she took the finished quilt as a remembrance. I've also done some reading that if they were going to make quilts once they moved to the prairies, the new outland, they wouldn't be making fancy quilts. They would be making more utilitarian quilts. That's my personal interpretation, that she took a finished quilt, perhaps as her remembrance of home, because she was leaving home forever.
And Barb and I talked about that before the program started, you know, how connected we are now through Zoom. But in 1856, if a person decided they were moving from Pennsylvania to Iowa, that was likely the last time that they would see their Pennsylvania connections, family, friends, neighbors, etc. So the pattern, do you suppose it was a published pattern, Barb, or something that was devised by friends, by someone and shared with friends? I mean, the fact that we see it replicated regionally, how did that happen, do you suppose? And this is partially conjecture, I suppose.
The general feeling of these locale special designs in southeastern Pennsylvania is that they were not published patterns, because if they were published patterns, they would appear someplace else also. One person, a group of 2 to 5 people came up with the idea. We really don't know. But our theory is that they were designed in this spot and the women shared with each other. Quilting was one of the things that they could share, being isolated out on their farms. They could get together. There was a little bit of competition, perhaps. You know, my circle lays nice and flat. Does your circle lay nice and flat? I've got more tulips than you do. You know, we don't know. We can only speculate how women would react to it, but no, there is no evidence that there was a published pattern.
So you've mentioned now this idea of regional or specialized patterns, and we've talked a great deal about the bullseye pattern, of course, because that's the quilt we have. But in the time that we have left, Barb has prepared would like to share with us a couple of other regional patterns specific to southeastern Pennsylvania. And so are we ready to move on to that,
Yeah.
Barb? Yeah, I thought so.
Okay. I mentioned where Lancaster County is, just below Berks County. And these are known locally as Bowmansville Star quilts. They are simple one-patch quilts. They're postage stamp quilts. The little squares measure 1 to 1 1/4 inches, except for the one on the right. That's a 1930s version of the 1880s on the left. They are called Bowmansville Stars because they are found in the area surrounding Bowmansville. Bowmansville is another one of those little crossroads towns. It's about 30 minutes from where I live, and it truly is a little crossroads with, you know, stop signs on the one set of roads. But the quilts were made on farms surrounding Bowmansville. I've done some research on this particular design, and it's about a 10-mile radius from the town of Bowmansville that I have found the farms where the quilts were made. Now, many of these stayed in the families for whatever reason, but I have found one that was made in downtown Bowmansville. If you want to call 5 houses and a hotel a downtown, it was made by the sister of the local justice of the peace. She was his housekeeper. But who would her women friends be? The farm wives in the farms surrounding Bowmansville. So this is a local layout found in Bowmansville.
I just have to interject. If any of you have kiddos in your life that play Minecraft like mine do, this is especially akin to that because everything is built with squares. So just a little aside. This is what I might call this the Minecraft star, just in my own little household.
Okay. I had 2 daughters and they're grown, so I'm not familiar with Minecraft.
So this isn't really a pattern, so to speak. It's really just a layout.
It's a layout, yes. It's a layout of a 1-patch quilt.
Which is the same as the Perkiomen.
Okay. The Perkiomen Valley quilt is found in Montgomery County. There is a creek called the Perkiomen Creek. Those familiar with the Southeast Pennsylvania, it's Collegeville, it's Berks County, and it empties into the Schuylkill, which empties into the Delaware River. So, but the Perkiomen Creek, Perkiomen is an Indian name that means cranberry because cranberries used to be grown along the Perkiomen Creek. But this is what we call a split 9-patch in a particular layout. There are several layouts that you can do the split 9-patch block, but when it's in this layout, it has the regional name Perkiomen Valley. If you look across the top, you can see the points going up and down. Those are the hills and valleys of the Perkiomen Valley, Perkiomen Creek Valley. If you want to see the specific split 9-patch, go up to the left-hand corner, look at the first little square, the second little square, and then the split triangle one with the blue and the white. That's the 9-patch, right, where Megan has her cursor. That is the 9-patch. And it's the arrangement of those 9 patches that gives us the hills and valleys. The formula, Germans are very well organized people. My dad was German. I know about this. The Perkiomen Valley quilt always has 100 blocks in it. It's 10 by 10 blocks. And if you count the diagonals across the top of the blue, you can see the 10 blocks, and then there's 10 down. And Perkiomen Valley quilts are always square. They are different sizes based on how big the little squares are and how many borders are on it. This one dates to probably around 1920. Perkiomen Valley quilts were a little bit later than the other 2 designs that we've seen. Okay. And this is another variation. It again has the same split 9-patch, but they've arranged it slightly different. This one is called regionally Center Valley. But you can see its relationship to the Perkiomen Valley concept. And it again is 10 blocks by 10 blocks. Okay. And this is the true Perkiomen Valley again, 10 blocks by 10 blocks. And what's fun about this one is if you look down at the bottom on the left-hand side, you can see she got kind of lost all the way down at the bottom. Okay, that's the right side. Go to the other side. Okay, yeah. You can see that she kind of got lost and turned one of her blocks the wrong way. The third one over. So that's the traditional Perkiomen Valley found in this small section of southeastern Pennsylvania, our regional blocks. And then I'll let Megan talk about this one.
Right. And then just to make a connection back to Iowa, an exhibit we did last year titled Man Made. This was a quilt that was featured in that, is made by Tony Jacobson, who actually is on the board here at the Iowa Quilt Museum and is a quilt designer here in Winterset. And this is his, it's called Perkiomen Medallion. So of course it's not truly the Perkiomen Valley pattern because it's not a 9-patch, but it's a modern interpretation of the same overall aesthetic of that Perkiomen Valley quilt. And so these Pennsylvania German patterns, although they were very regionalized at one point in time and mostly harken from the 19th century, have had a lasting impact on quilt designs, even now into the 21st century.
And Tony did stay true to the Perkiomen Valley formula. Each one of his small Perkiomen valleys are 10 blocks by 10 blocks. They're just split triangles instead of split 9 patches.
Right, right. Somebody wanted to see the first Bowmansville star again. So let me go back just a little bit to that.
Yeah, that was at an exhibit that I curated, and it just shows how the same pattern stays through the years with slight variations. This pattern, I have seen a contemporary version that somebody has patterned, but these are made whatever their traditional way is. These are pre-patterned.
Mhm. Carl, do you have anything else that you want to add? I don't want to skip over you if there's anything else that you want to interject.
No, I think we've covered the thing. Thank you for your help.
Well,
Thank you, Barb.
sharing your quilt with us and kind of prompting this whole discovery of regional Pennsylvania styles of quilting and how this one particular quilt is connected from Pennsylvania all the way to Iowa. Barb, anything else that you want to add at this point?
Oh, I want to thank Carl and his daughter for donating the quilt, and I want to thank the Iowa Quilt Museum for thinking it was special enough to post on Facebook, because I was super excited when I saw it to discover that there was another one out there that up until now had literally just been stored in the blanket chests, as we say. So we don't know how many were made. You know, maybe there's 4 more out there somewhere in blanket chests, but we do know that it's a very tiny number. And please thank your daughter and son-in-law for their research that has helped us narrow down the time frame from somewhere circa 1960 to probably a little closer to 1850, I'm sorry. So thank you. And thank you, Megan, for inviting me to share and delve a little deeper.
Well, thank you both for your contributions, and thanks to everyone who has tuned in today. I know that we've all learned a great deal, and it's, you know, these quilts or these Tuesday programs are not necessarily meant to be historically educational, but this one sure has been, and I think that a lot of us have really appreciated that. Remember that if anyone was not able to log on today for this program, they can find it on our YouTube page, and that can be accessed through our website as well. And the address for that is iowaquiltmuseum.org. Before we sign off, I just want to let you know of a special event that's coming up with the Iowa Quilt Museum in June 5th to be specific, which is a Saturday. That is our community-wide celebration of quilting, quilt history, and quilt present, and that is called the Airing of the Quilts. And so we do quilt displays all over our community, in our famous covered bridges and our courthouse and our city park and in homes and businesses. So if you're feeling like making a trip to Iowa to see the Iowa Quilt Museum, that's a great weekend to do it, and you can see extra things as well. Of course, there's also information about that on our website. So once again, thank you, Barb. Thank you, Carl. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. And we look forward to seeing you one more time next Tuesday. We'll be joined by Phyllis Schrag of Ames, and she is going to be sharing some information about the quilts and the quilt life of Marie Webster, who is the person for whom the the Quilters Hall of Fame was created in her home. So we look forward to that, and have a lovely day, everyone. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Megan.